Hi, I'm Louise Denny. I'm part of the Loretto community and have been for some 50 years. God, that's long. So I was asked to give a little reflection on feminism and the Loretto community, the Loretto Women's Network, and where we might be now and where we might be going, or some possibilities along those lines. So that's what I'm going to do. Feminism, is a perspective. It's not a definition of something. It's a perspective, much like nonviolence or inclusion. It's a perspective through which we see all issues and systems and relationships. So there was a time in our history when we probably thought of it as a social justice issue by itself. I think we've moved beyond that to seeing it as a perspective through which we can look at social justice issues, and it can become part of the weave of that fabric. The chapters about Loretto's initiation and history of feminism in both Naming Our Truth and A Century of Change with Virginia Williams and Marianne Cunningham's chapters are important as a basis of this perspective. They raise questions and pose challenges. They tell the story. But you know what they say about rear view mirrors? A rear view mirror is essential to safe driving. You can't be without it. But if the rear view mirror is so big that it takes over the windshield, then a crash is inevitable. So we have to see behind us, we have to know the history, but we can't let the rear view mirror block where we're going or impair forward movement. The questions we were asked way back at the beginning of the Loretto Women's Network are still important questions to ask. Is this relationship one of mutuality? Whether it's personal relationships, relationships formed by a structure, are all parts of the work, any work, valued equally? Are human rights accessible to all or just to a few? Who is excluded and why? Is decision-making in any system shared or reserved to just a few? Who is excluded and why? Feminism doesn't necessarily mean no structure or no boundaries. I think at some point we sort of thought it did. We sort of thought boundaries should go away and there should be no set anything. Anything should be set. But in fact, boundaries are a challenge for women. Maybe especially women in canonical communities. To have any boundaries at all is a challenge because we've been schooled to give it all. Give all. You can't work too much or too long. You can't be inconvenienced enough. So we've been schooled to put ourselves last. And the airlines have it right when they say, put your own mask oxygen on first before you help others. It's tricky. Healthy adults need boundaries. Healthy institutions do too. If the boundaries and structures are based in prejudice or a need for power, they need to be rethought. So as Loretto moves into some expanded suffrage within Loretto's decision-making, again, we need to pay attention. We need to do what we do with intention. While we may have accepted the challenge to open decision-making somewhat, the challenge remains: who is excluded and why? Is this a healthy boundary or a cover-up for clinging to power? It's all very messy, and there's no one right answer. I came across this thing about there are 4 levels of sexism. There's individual sexism, where personal attitudes and behavior indicate a negative judgment about a person based on gender. An interesting thing is that baby girls are more likely to be held, while baby males are kept more at a distance and admired. Isn't that interesting? Think about it. There's social and structural sexism, attitudes and interactions between people and groups. For example, women tend to take up less personal space around their bodies than men. Women are usually given smaller offices and workspace, while men get larger offices and larger workspace. Then the larger office translates into more power and authority. Institutional sexism, the wage scales of women versus men for the same responsibilities. We're familiar with this. The need to raise the minimum wage, which disproportionately affects women. Caucasian women make 70 cents for every dollar a Caucasian male makes. African American women make 60 cents for every dollar. Hispanic women make 50 cents for every dollar. So in our time, you know, as I look back on Loretto Women's Network and some of the earlier energy we spent was on getting women elected, a lot of political activity, increasing the female representation in Congress, etc. Now, if we look at, and now today, if we look at Congress, it's 20% are women. Does that mean that 20% are kinder and gentler? No way. No, it doesn't. Mia Love, an African-American woman elected to the House of Representatives, told reporters she was coming to Washington to, quote, be a nightmare for the Democratic Party. Joni Ernst from Iowa was elected on ads describing her as a gun-toting farm girl and a lieutenant colonel, who has much more than lipstick in her purse. She was going to unload on Obamacare. So the assumption that to elect a woman was to elect the compassion of a mother, and to elect a woman of color was even better. That assumption doesn't hold in today's milieu of hyper-extremism and fundamentalist worldview. So we've had to, look a little more deeply at the criteria we're looking at for where we cast our vote. It's not just a woman. It's not just, in the Roman Catholic Church, Loretto has, through LWN, supported the ordination of women. Now, some have likened this to an African-American woman being an officer in the KKK, which is my own perspective. What is questionable might be, we ask, do women have equal access to goods, services, status, and power in the church? What we need to be asking, does the institution itself have the right to status and power? Is gaining equal access to that status and power really what we want? We might have to look for a more basic question than simply access to power. Women have the right to be combat soldiers. Now, our struggle was and continues to be to gain the right, to gain rights. But the rights we need to gain have to include the right to make mistakes in judgment, the right to climb a corporate ladder, the right to become among the rich and powerful. And then we have to ask, does anybody have that right? I think the feminist perspective is now a part of the fabric of Loretto. It's not a listing of women's issues. We acted our way into a new way of thinking. We recognize that the personal is political, that in the end, it's all about you and me and how we are together, how we relate institutionally as well as personally. It is the integration of these principles into who we are as Loretto that makes some ways of operating disturbing or frustrating. We've taken the principles of subsidiarity and collegiality seriously. We've rejected the notion that community is like a family with parents and children. And we've chosen to be adults together. We've experienced the dictatorship within the institutional church, and we have tried to reconstruct and recreate our community to claim our own lives and make our own decisions as an adult, ethical community. We are hypersensitive to anything that smacks of this dictatorship behavior within the community. We've experienced abuse. Some of us, no doubt, have experienced physical, emotional, sexual abuse in our histories. We've experienced abuse as an institution. As adult women, we are hypersensitive to any behavior, personal or institutional, that is demeaning or lacks respect. So where are we? Where do we want to go? I hope we continue to ask the questions and continue to act into new ways of thinking. Well, I think it's a mutual, there's a mutuality and with any engagement, with any movement, there's a mutuality that occurs that, I became changed because I did draft counseling during the Vietnam War. And I think there's a mutuality that occurs. And the same thing happens between us, primarily a women's community, when we engage in adult consensual relationships and adult consensual creation of the kind of institution we want to join with to make changes in this world. Well, that's why it's so messy, because we do need to challenge any systems or institutions or people who would deny us rights due to our sex because we're female. So we do need to be in that struggle. At the same time, we have to ask, what are the rights I really want? What are those rights? Do I want a livable wage? Of course I do. Do I want affordable childcare? Absolutely. Do I want the right to be in combat in the armed forces? Well, maybe I want the right, but I sure as heck am not going to do it. And I sure as heck wish nobody would. So that's where it gets messy, I think, is that it's just not, it's not all black and white. We're in a very gray world these days.
You also touched a little bit on tactics or perspectives. And so however we work for those rights has maybe changed a bit in the last 30 years. Would you have anything to say about that?
Like, I don't say, you say more. What are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about, protest vis-a-vis political work, vis-a-vis personal communal work. I mean, you did focus a lot on it's kind of each personal journey, but here we have a community, and we are values-wise committed to working for justice. And has that scene changed considerably in terms of how you do that?
Well, it's always been easier for us, in this case I mean the Loretto community, to take on the role of a messiah. And that it's always been easier for us to say we are helping the less, either the disenfranchised or the oppressed, etc. And it's not been very easy for us to take on that definition for ourselves, you know? And so it's difficult for us to claim our own space within this community as you know, the overworked world of Loretto women has been praised throughout our history. And so we have to take a different look at ourselves and how we relate with each other and how our institution relates with other institutions. We have to take a different look at that. It's not, it's a process of, well, like 12-step programs. It's a process of looking at yourself and moving through those steps best we can, in concert with who we can be in concert with. Well, you know, you're kind of asking the wrong person about that, because I don't take my clues from Pope Francis, frankly. And so, I don't really know. I mean, I'm sure he's a fine chap and all of that, but I don't take my clues from him, either my permissions or my openings or my closings or anything really. So for those who find hope in Pope Francis, go for it. More power to you. It's just not my thing. But one perspective is that the rights, we need to struggle for the rights. I think that's true, you know. We need to continually assert that women's bodies are their own, and all the things that have to do with the rights of human beings. But we also need to question the systems, you know, that make certain things a right. I mean, I think it's very difficult, and I think it's difficult in this community to address those kinds of things. You know, for a long time with the Mary Rhodes Awards, for instance, the Mary Rhodes Awards were started to applaud women who have made efforts for women in some way in their lives. And very quickly, it became women who were doing good work, wonderful work, but maybe not for women. It lost the women's focus. It became women working for justice and racism, or all kinds of wonderful things. But that fact of it being for women kind of got lost, which is a shame. So we have to keep that perspective still, that has a place, but it's also in a larger context of the injustices of the world. And I just think it's tough. I think it's tough. I see changes happening. I won't characterize them as all negative or all positive, frankly. I grieve the loss of some very strong voices who challenged the community. And, and in that grieving have to find other voices. I mean, I have to find my own, And so I don't think all is lost or flushed down the toilet or whatever. I think it's kind of swirling around there, but, I can stop the flush. That's a gross image, isn't it? Well, it kind of says it, though. It really does say it, so I'll let it go. Yeah, it works. I think, when we opened when we started having shelters in St. Louis for abused women, kind of did an underground railroad and of private homes. Those were not our issues. You know, we were not so overtly beaten and needing shelter in that way. But by identifying with those women, we could bring some tools, maybe, to help them sort through what it is they wanted to do with the rest of their lives or the next part of their lives. So I think the same thing is true in most of these things. While they may not be our issues or it may not be my issue, I can learn an awful lot from people who are struggling in that arena, whatever it is, you know? And so, you know, it is true that, you know, if it's your issue, it's my issue. And I would bring a different perspective to it, perhaps, or you would bring a different perspective to some of my issues. But it's together, we work it out, and, you know, we try anyway. So I don't get off on disavowing anything as not my issue, you know. Well, it's walking with people, you know, and it's walking with and being whoever I am and you being whoever you are, and walking with those people who need companionship. And I'm one of them. I need companionship. And so I will, I will ask for that and hopefully respond to those who also ask for it.